Chapter 16. Assassinating the Sorceress. 1859 found the group of Seeds walking through General Caraway's front hall again. Squall led the way up, not needing the maid this time to show him the way. His eyes scanned around for some sign of Renoa, but wherever the general had hidden her wasn't immediately in sight. Not that he really expected it to be. Caraway was already waiting for them in his office. He was staring at the wall of useless martini glasses as they filed in. He looked up as the last one stepped inside, then immediately down to the watch strapped to his wrist. 1859. 19 o'clock. Right on time. Seeds really were quite good. He probably should have just hired them outright instead of contacting Martine to send him someone suited to the job. Time to form the teams, he said without preamble, facing out into the room. The sniper and the leader of this operation will form the sniper team. The leader's role is vital. Squall's eyebrow raised slightly. What was that supposed to mean? If the plan fails for some reason, or should the sniper miss? Psh! Irvine scoffed, waving the words away. The leader must carry out a direct assault against the sorceress, Caraway finished like he hadn't been interrupted. This plan was devised carefully because we intend this to be a covert operation. However, our ultimate goal is to eliminate the sorceress. We must achieve this at any and all costs. Even if they uncover our identities. Even if we're captured afterwards. Failure is not an option. So, who's going to lead the operation? Squall's eyes were on the ground. But he didn't need to be looking up to feel everyone cast their eyes to him in turn. He had really rather hoped Quistis might have stepped forward. Why was everyone insisting on making him leader? Did no one else even want to try to take the title? Zell always seemed so eager to be in charge of something. Whatever. It wasn't in Squall's nature to let others do the hard, dirty work anyway. He wouldn't throw others under the bus like that. He looked up, resigned to his position. Again. I will, he said. Caraway wasn't surprised he stepped forward. He had rather been expecting the young man to speak up immediately though. That he had waited for the others to speak up instead of immediately taking on the mantle of leadership himself spoke volumes about his character. Caraway still disliked him intensely, but he nodded, accepting him. Fine. I'll leave everything up to you. Irvine and I will make up the sniper team. So that makes the gateway team. He looked over to see Selfie, Quistis, and Zell already up and ready to work. Selfie almost looked overeager for the task. Hoo-hoo! She yelled, jumping up and down happily. Roger, Quistis said, nodding with her eyes glowing. Stop staring, Squall thought reflexively. Let's do it! Zell yelled, his emotions running high again. So who's gonna be leader of the gateway team? Selfie asked, deferring to him. Squall didn't need to see Zell shadow boxing impressively out of the corner of his eye to know that he would dearly like that role. Though he never tried to take leadership from Squall, and why in Hind's name not? He still wanted the responsibility Squall would grant to him. Not going to happen. Sorry, Zell. Instructor Treep, he said, looking to her. He corrected himself. She wasn't an instructor any longer, she was a seed as he was. Quistis Treep, you're in charge. Okay, she nodded, smiling. At least he had that much faith in her. Leave it to me. Okay, General Caraway nodded, getting their attention again. Let's begin. Follow me to your positions. Squall and Irvine were right behind the general. When Quistis and Zell moved to follow though, Zell's sigh stalled them for a moment. I don't think he likes me, he said, his shoulders slumping. Who? Selfie asked. Squall. He doesn't like me. Does he? Zell, is now really the time for this? Quistis asked as gently as she was able. He sighed. No, I suppose not. Let's go. The three of them started towards the door to catch up with the others. Quistis arrived first but, as she was reaching out for the doorknob, it burst open and Rinoa came exploding in. Quistis jumped back quickly to avoid a collision. Rinoa was red in the face, panting slightly, but she was grinning. It was a look that Quistis saw often on underclassmen after defeating their first monster. Hi! She beamed, waving to them. Finally got out of there! The door to his room was never going to be able to be fixed, and the dagger-style letter opener from the nightstand was as dull as a butter knife now, but she was free and that was the point. Did that man say something? She pointed over her shoulder. No, not really, Zell leaned on one foot, grinning at her. Rinoa wasn't listening. Her eyes were looking around for a brooding face and stormy eyes that were nowhere to be seen. Where's Squall? Darn it! She had really wanted to show him how she had hacked her way to freedom. She rather thought he would be proud. That singular question hit Quistis hard. She was the first thing on Squall's mind, and he was the first thing on hers. I'm sorry, Rinoa, Quistis said, not sounding sorry at all, but we have to get going. Hold on a sec, Rinoa held out one hand to stop her, not catching Quistis's tone in her excitement. She reached under her duster into her back pocket and pulled out her prize for the night. The bright gold shined under the room's lights, the blue gem in pride of place seemed to be glowing with its own dark light. The wide bangle was made for a female's wrist but still seemed rather big in Rinoa's hand. Take a look at this. Rinoa showed it off with a proud grin. This is called an Odin bangle. I found it in that man's room. Odin. Zell repeated, his eyes raising as he took a second look at the jewelry. What you gonna do with it? Selfie asked curiously, looking it over. Rinoa tossed it between her hands as she stepped further into the room. It's supposed to suppress a sorceress's powers, but its effects are still largely unknown. So I don't think they're going to use it for this mission. If it's Odin brand, it should be pretty effective, Zell said, grinning. They're number one when it comes to magical goods. Right. Right. Rinoa nodded, a bit breathless with happiness at her find. Quistis's hands were clenched into shaking fists. Listen to the others. Talking to her like this was normal and acceptable. An Odin bangle? If that could possibly be effective, they would have used it in the first place. And it was a sniper-style assassination. They weren't supposed to be getting up close to the sorceress. Quistis snapped. So what exactly do you plan to do with it? She demanded to know, turning with burning eyes to the annoying Rinoa. Are you planning to have the sorceress put it on? Who? When? How? As Quistis spoke, she stomped closer to Rinoa. Her foot came down to punctuate each harshly asked question. Her face was drawn in anger. She honestly could not stand that Squall was so seemingly interested in a creature like this. Rinoa met Quistis's anger with a grin, She put her hands on her hips, grinning at her like she was asking silly questions.
That's what we're going to discuss. We don't have time for that.
Quistis stomped angrily.
Squall and Irvine are already standing by. We have our side of the operation to carry out, too. And you're not involved in either one. You understand, don't you? This isn't a father-daughter quarrel. This isn't a game.
At hearing that man being called her father, at being yelled at like she was a child, Rinoa turned away from Quistis. She put her nose in the air, refusing to yell back at her. She wasn't going to dignify that with a response. Quistis wasn't waiting for one though. She was already leaving the room. Selphie and Zell looked between the two of them awkwardly. Eventually though, duty and seed training won out and they walked out after Quistis, sending apologetic looks over their shoulders. The door shut behind them and Rinoa looked forward again, hurt flashing across her face. They hadn't even tried to listen to her. They had dismissed her outright.
Who said this was a game?
She asked no one, turning from the door. Turning from them.
I understand what's going on.
She crouched down, curling in on herself.
It's not like I don't have a plan.
Why did everyone treat her like a child? Why did no one ever believe in her? Why was it that Squall was the only one that had ever invited her in? The one person who pushed everyone away was also the only person who didn't treat her like a precious princess. Something to be treasured but never utilized. She bet he wouldn't have rejected her outright like that. Even if he had said no, he wouldn't have been cruel about it. He would have been logical and calm. Rinoa's put her forehead to her knees as tears came into her eyes. Squall and Irvine were waiting with the general to cross the street when Quistis and the others came out of the mansion. He didn't know what took them so long. He didn't care to ask. He was already thinking ahead to what his role in this night would be. The buses weren't running still, but the streets were packed with people eager to see the coming parade and their new ambassador. It was a citywide party, and the jubilant feeling in the atmosphere washed over them without touching them.
I'll make the first charge if we make the full-on attack,
Squall told Irvine quietly as they crossed the street behind the general.
I'll try to buy some time for you and the others to escape.
There was no point in all of them getting captured.
That won't be necessary, you martyr,
Irvine rolled his eyes.
I'll get the job done.
Galbadian soldiers were policing the rowdy crowds, trying to keep everyone off the street and out of trouble. Squall moved through them easily, keeping the general in sight, as they moved towards a small, rather sparsely populated bridge. It wasn't on the parade route, so people weren't congregating there. However, it did lead towards the center of the city and it was far easier to walk there than to try to fight through the crowds.
So,
Irvine spoke up curiously,
is it true that seeds aren't supposed to question their mission? At all? Not even to save their own lives? Why?
There were times when Squall would like to know that himself. Now, for example. This whole mission made so little sense to him. At the same time.
What do you care?
He returned shortly.
I mean, if you knew that your enemies were pure evil, you would get more fired up to fight them, right? You have to have your own opinion. So if you really believed in a cause, you would fight harder for it, right? That's just how humans work.
An enemy that was pure evil? What a fanciful notion. Right and wrong weren't what separated people, what made them enemies. It was simply a difference of opinion. It was their different standpoints, their perspectives, that separated people. Both sides blame the other for what was wrong, both sides believes that they're right and had the one true answer. There was no good or evil, light or dark. There were just two sides holding different views. Squall said none of that. He kept to himself. Irvine gave him a look, still fully expecting a response that wasn't coming. Squall wasn't in a sharing kind of mood. He just wanted to get this over with, get Renoa back, then get out of here.
I think I would be more motivated to know that my enemy was evil,
Irvine said, mostly to himself since Squall wasn't participating in the conversation.
It would make it easier anyway.
Still no response. Irvine fell silent as they all made their way onto the densely populated city streets. It seemed like the entire population of Galbadia had come to see the sorceress. Had come to celebrate her rise to power and therefore Galbadia's rise in power. General Caraway moved to the entrance of the Ark and used a PIN code to open the electronic lock. A code that Selfie looked at and quickly memorized by habit alone. One never knew. Caraway held open the door and looked to Quistis.
The gateway team will wait inside. Up a ladder you'll find the control panel. Remember, the sorceress will pass through at exactly 20 o'clock. In that instant, lower the gates using the console and trap her inside the gateway. There will be a narrow window up there so you can watch to be sure that you're hitting it at the right time. Do not fail.
Quistis nodded to him once before walking through. Selfie and Zell went in after her. Caraway let the door shut and walked away. Squall and Irvine followed dutifully. At almost exactly the same spot he had indicated earlier, there was a couple in the way now. General Caraway turned to the two of them.
You two will wait here,
he ordered.
General, why has the sorceress decided to have such an extravagant parade?
Squall asked, curious despite himself.
She wants to establish her place in Galbadia Garden, since she has chosen it to serve as her base of operations. This parade is her way of cementing her power in Galbadia as a whole. Proving that she's important, basically. The people appreciate and need such displays. You will understand as you age. The flashier, more elaborate someone is, the more likely they are to be listened to. And the more likely they are to be heard, the more likely they are to be obeyed. It's just a power play.
Well, that at least explained why Galbadia Garden wanted her out. Music began playing loudly over the crowd and General Caraway looked to the gates. Just beyond them, he could see the parade getting into place. The seat reserved for the sorceress remained empty yet, but she would be coming soon.
It's starting, he said. I'm returning to my residence. I can't be seen here. Good luck.
Squall nodded, accepting the sentiment as he looked to the gates. His gun blade was stored away in his inventory because he couldn't have weapons on the street right now. His fingers were itching to grab hold of it again though. He felt naked without his weapon. Stand by again. How soul-crushingly boring. Guilt was sitting hot and uncomfortable in Quistis's belly when she stepped out of the Arc of Triumph and back out onto the streets. What was wrong with her? Snapping like that? That wasn't like her at all. She was a mature, rational adult. She should have responded in that situation like one, not like a child having their favorite toy snatched away from them.
Maybe I was too hard on her,
she said as Zell and Selfie stepped out after her.
Too hard?
Zell frowned. Yeah, she had definitely been too hard on her. It wasn't like Quistis had any sort of claim on Squall. At best, they were friends. Most likely, they were colleagues. Just because she wanted more didn't mean she had the right to take it out on Rinoa when she didn't get what she wanted. If anything, Quistis should be happy that Squall was opening up to anyone. He had never before shown interest in another person. That he was so obviously becoming attached to this one was only a good thing for him. She should be encouraging it, not acting petty and jealous that things hadn't turned out like she had wanted.
I'm going to go apologize,
she decided firmly. And she was going to do what was best for Squall. She was going to step back and let this, whatever it was, flourish.
You mean?
Rinoa? Zell asked softly. He didn't sound like he was opposing the decision. He hadn't wanted to say anything, but he kind of agreed.
But.
Selfie looked between them.
We can't just leave our post. We still have time until 20 o'clock,
Quistis said, looking at the large clock. She wasn't going for a tear-filled, heartfelt, soul-bearing speech. She just wanted to say she was sorry and close this chapter of her life.
You two wait here.
Quistis turned and began walking back towards General Caraway's mansion.
We can't just.
Zell looked around as Selfie jogged after Quistis.
Hey, wait up.
Heavy footsteps told Rinoa that she was no longer alone. She lifted her head and looked over her shoulder to see the face that she had been avoiding for the better part of a year step inside. Her doting father, she shivered just calling him that, was staring at her in a very distant way. It was hard to believe that man had any feelings at all for her. Far too often, she felt like a duty to him. Just something that he was required to do. Like training soldiers. Or cleaning a latrine. Rinoa deliberately turned away and put her face back on her knees. She raised her hand and waved him away without giving him a single word. If he was going to treat her like nothing, then she was going to do the same in turn.
It'll be chaos out there soon,
he said quite calmly, like he might be referring to a storm.
You'll be safe here.
Rinoa waved him off a second time. She didn't care. She didn't want to talk to him. She was leaving this city the second Squall finished with this mission. Then she was going to get a tan on a fabulous white sand Balam beach while flashing her string bikini-covered boobs at Squall and see how long it took to make that distant facade crack. Daddy's little girl was going to become a mercenary's woman and it was going to feel that much better for knowing it was killing him. Caraway didn't attempt to reach out for his daughter again. How he wished she would look at him like she used to. When she used to depend on him. Back in the days when she had been so small and would climb in his lap and point at the stars and smile. Those days weren't coming back and he didn't know how to bring them back. If they even could be brought back. So he turned and walked back through the door. Rinoa heard it shut behind him and she let out a deep breath and stood up. She immediately felt weary and heavy. Like she had just gotten over a flu. Then a mechanical beeping from the door made her jump. It was the same beeping that had gone off right before the door to his room sealed her shut inside of it earlier. And there was no handy dagger letter opener this time.
Oh, no. He's gonna lock me in.
She turned without thinking and ran for the door. The one-person frame had never looked so large and imposing as it did in that moment. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as indecision fell over her and her footsteps slowed. Without thinking, she reached up and grabbed the silver ring she had dangling from a thin chain around her neck. Her mother's wedding ring. A symbol of happier times. She could see Squall in her mind's eye. He was standing right outside the door looking at her. He was waiting to see what she would do. He wouldn't pull her through the door, nor would he force her to remain inside. He would let her make her own decision. He would allow her to find the strength to stand by her own principles. She let out a breath as her eyes closed and focused on that strength. She had fought monsters she didn't believe she could defeat. She had tagged along with a group of seeds and stood, maybe not their equal, but at least with them. And she had Squall to show her how to be strong.
I can do it.
She nodded to herself. Rinoa sprinted out the door and ran off down the hallway to the left. She was going to go to her room, her old room, and climb out through the window. Through that way, she could take the servants' entrance into the presidential residence bypassing the parade entirely. She could gain access to the sorceress before she ever stepped foot outside. No guards. No witnesses. As she turned the corner, from the opposite direction, Quistis came from downstairs. She was walking determinedly towards the office, Zell and Selfie one step behind her. Words were coming out of her mouth before she even stepped through the doorway.
Rinoa, I'm sorry
her words cut off when she didn't see the raven-haired girl within. One loud beep preceded to the slamming of the office door. The three seeds jumped and turned.
Did
Quistis looked to the two of them.
Did we get locked in?
Selfie looked confused before realization came over her face.
That caraway guy.
Zell groaned loudly.
We're smack dab in the middle of a family quarrel here.
Quistis felt her stomach drop. They were locked in here, far away from their post. They couldn't do their part of the job. And if they couldn't do their part, Squall and Irvine couldn't do theirs. The entire mission was going to fail.
This is bad,
she murmured. Then a new, disturbing thought came over her.
Oh, no, Rinoa. What about Rinoa?
Zell asked as Selfie moved to begin jerking against the doorknob. It remained steadfastly locked. Quistis bit her lip, really rather hoping that her dreadful feeling was wrong.
Rinoa's probably on her way to see the sorceress as we speak. She only wanted to help us and I know what kind of person she is.
The servants' entrance to the presidential residence was mostly hidden. Rinoa only knew about it because she had always been able to see it from her bedroom window. The staff was too busy worrying about the ceremony to even care about a frail-appearing girl like her. She walked in like she was supposed to be there and made her way around towards the front of the palace. The sorceress would be in the guest rooms on the top floor. Rinoa had been there before with her family when she was young. There was no way she would be able to get away with walking around inside as she was. Which meant she had to come in from the outside. The method for her entrance revealed itself as she came around towards the front gates. A large black vehicle designed for moving storage boxes. Some of the cargo, bearing the presidential seal, was already unloaded. However, there was still some boxes piled into the back of the truck. It reached up high enough to be just above level with the second-story outer walkway. That place wasn't guarded at the moment. She could leap across, then climb over that glass roof there, cross the outer podium, then straight to the guest rooms. She ran over to the lowest crate and took a breath as she put her hands on the top. Her eyes closed as she tried to bring Cypher to mind. Confident, powerful, brave Cypher. He had always made her feel like she could do anything. That confidence of his was infectious. She pulled out that old feeling of boundless confidence and used it to power her limbs as she jumped up and climbed aboard the lowest box.
I'm not a seed, but...
she said to herself, to Quistis, to that man. To everyone that had ever told her that she couldn't do something. That it was too dangerous. She ran across the crates and jumped a small gap to the truck bed. She turned to the next lowest crate and put her hands down atop that. Boundless confidence. Unwavering certainty. Unquestionable strength. Use those things that Cypher taught you to move forward. Prove to them all that you weren't weak. What was it he used to say? Move yourself one step closer to your dream with each victory. And each time she climbed further up this path, she had won another victory against all those naysayers.
I can do this,
she said determinedly, moving up. She turned to the next two crates. The crates that put her above the second story. She put her foot against the lowest one and used it to vault herself over the next one.
This isn't some kind of game.
Let nothing get in your way, Cypher would say. She was going to do this in his memory. She was going to take that confidence he had bestowed upon her and prove the world wrong. This sorceress had snuffed out a life that had burned with such promise. Rinoa took a step back, then took 2 running steps forward. She launched herself from the highest crate and across a heart-stoppingly large gap. Her feet lost purchase as she landed, but she was regaining her balance before she could properly fall. Cypher would have been great, Rinoa was sure. He always had such grand dreams. He had spoken like nothing was impossible and made others around him feel it too. The sorceress had destroyed that. Had destroyed something wonderful. But he lived on in the people he touched. His memory gave him longevity beyond the grave. Rinoa was his living legacy. She ran around the balcony towards a ladder used by cleaning staff to access the glass roof. She climbed up quickly. The glass roof looked down into the formal events hall. The very place the sorceress's ceremony would have taken place. It was all cleared out now as everyone prepared for the speech and subsequent parade. Rinoa vaulted herself up onto that and ran across the glass. There. She could see the guest quarters. The most obvious route would be across the podium, but Rinoa knew for a fact that there was a small window that could lead inside. It was supposed to remain locked, but staff never locked it because they liked to come out here to smoke in secret. There. That would bring her in the back way. Make it less obvious she had broken in. She was just another well-wisher coming to admire the sorceress. Rinoa was fully prepared for servants to be around. There always was. Expect tonight. The upper floors where the guest rooms were was completely deserted as she climbed down in through the window. The halls were darkened. Silent. Eerie. A strange fear came into Rinoa's gut as she looked around. The president's residence had always felt more like a public space than a home, but just at the moment it was completely lifeless. Her footsteps were absorbed by the fabulously soft carpet. She moved down the hall slowly, trying to force Cypher's confidence back over her. She would take down the sorceress in his memory. Then, having done what she could to avenge him, she could move on properly. The room the sorceress was inhabiting was clearly marked. Not only because it was the most extravagant of the rooms, but because there was a literal plaque on the door now. Sorceress Edia. So that was her name. Rinoa paused outside of that door and took a deep breath. She reached into her back pocket and took hold of the Odin bangle. She closed her hand around it and tried to draw strength from its presence. For Cypher. She would avenge him. Wrapping his confidence around her like a cloak, Rinoa opened the door without knocking. She tried to fix her face into one of respect and girlish innocence. She knew how to look helpless because she had spent so long being exactly that. The guest rooms had changed greatly since Rinoa had been here last. The sorceress had obviously put her own, strange touches on it. There were considerably more sheer curtains hanging from the ceiling than last time. And a distinct lack of bed. Or dresser. Or any furniture really. Except for a single, elegant chair that more resembled a throne in the center of the room. Rinoa's heart was in her throat. The sorceress was seated in that chair. Unmoving. Almost unnaturally still. Garbed all in black, wearing a strange headpiece over hair she kept tightly bound and out of sight. Rinoa's footsteps echoed loudly against the marble floor. She knew the sorceress had to know she was there. Boundless confidence. She took in a deep breath.
Excuse me,
she started, her voice weak and thready. She surreptitiously cleared her throat and tried to inject more strength into it.
I'm the daughter of, the Galbadian militaries, General Caraway.
Ew. That was awkward to admit after so long of refusing to even think his name. It was a good cover though. She was rather proud of how quickly it had come to her.
I thought I'd come pay my respects to you.
Yeah, that sounded legit. Keep it going.
You know, cause of my father and all.
Good. Now bring it home.
So, I, brought you a small gift. In your honor. Please.
The sorceress hadn't moved. She gave no indication that she even heard Rinoa speaking. Her hands behind her back, the bangle shining in the low light, Rinoa started forward. Her mother's ring bounced against her chest. Cypher's confidence burned in her chest. This was going to work. She was doing this. Rinoa was almost even with the sorceress's shoulder. She could see the very subtle movement of her chest as she drew in slow breaths. Her wrist was right there. Rinoa could probably snap the bangle onto her right now. Then she would be nothing more than an ordinary human. And Rinoa was trained by a seed in fighting. She wouldn't stand a chance. For you, Cypher, she thought, her eyes locked on that wrist. The sudden coursing of what felt like white-hot lightning through her veins made Rinoa cry out. She was lifted clear off of her feet and thrown backwards. The lightning left her body just in time to slam against the marble floor. That hadn't felt like a thunder spell. That hadn't felt like any magic she had felt before. No. Be boundless confidence. Rinoa felt only fear as she lifted herself up. Her fingers were clenching the bangle so tight her knuckles had turned white. Her heart was going so fast it had drowned out all other sounds in her ears. She lifted herself and looked back at the sorceress. She still hadn't moved. Like Rinoa was less than a fly. At first, she didn't even notice the way the Odin bangle was vibrating. She was so filled with terror that the initial movements went completely unnoticed. Until her entire arm started shaking with it. Her eyes, wide with fear, snapped down to the hand that was moving against her will. It was lifting from the ground. No, The bangle was lifting from the ground and pulling her arm with it. She grabbed for her wrist, trying to put it back down. Her fingers struggled against the bangle as she tried to release it. She couldn't. It might as well have been attached to her now. Rinoa cried out again as the bangle suddenly shot into the air. Her shoulder almost felt like it was being jerked out of place as her fingers refused to listen to her commands. She heard Diablo's cry out in worry as he tried to alleviate her weight to put less pressure on her arm. His panic was doing nothing to ease hers. Her eyes were filling with tears as she looked up at the bangle. The choking, crushing pressure settled down over her like an ocean. She found it suddenly impossible to breathe as her whole body locked up. Something was being forced at her. An invisible wave of impenetrable magic. The Odin bangle was vibrating furiously now. Her hand was going numb from the force of it. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think, she felt Diablo's voice fading from her mind. Not like he was being forced out. He was just being silenced. And that only served to scare her further. Her partner that she had initially not even wanted was slipping away and she couldn't imagine anything more lonely. The vibrating got worse. The pressure continued to build. Rinoa felt like if something didn't break soon her body was going to implode under that force. Then something did break. The Odin bangle. The gold medal and blue gemstone shattered in her hand and she could feel something in her mind snapping with it. Gravity was much lighter than it should be when she suddenly dropped to the ground. A lingering after effect of Diablo's magic. She couldn't hear him, but his power still remained. So as her body crumbled awkwardly, like a puppet with its strings cut, she wasn't injured. The sorceress finally moved. Something withdrew into her head. Her hair? Threads? They hadn't been there a second ago. Had they been what had held Rinoa up? Simply invisible? The elaborate headpiece covering her hair jingled with tiny bells as a mask covering her eyes retracted back. Yellow eyes, golden like a cat's, looked out disinterestedly into the world. Sorceress Edia, despite that, was a very beautiful kind of woman. With unconcerned slowness, the woman lifted herself to her feet. The black silk of her gown hugged every curve of her well-shaped body. The claws extending from her gloves were rigid like steel. The happy bells on her headpiece were somehow eerie for being so cheerful. Rinoa's body moved. Her mind first blanked in panic, then screamed in terror as her body reacted beyond her control. She pushed herself to her feet as the sorceress rose. No. What was going on? Stop it. There was a voice in her head whispering things she couldn't understand. A dark, bone-chilling voice that terrified her. It was like she knew the voice, though she couldn't say that she had ever truly heard it before. It almost sounded too high. Too melodic. The sorceress's eyes locked on the door before her. The one that led to the podium outside. To the microphone and her waiting audience. It was time. She threw out her arms, summoning the last piece of her costume. The golden, gleaming ornament on her back trailed a pair of sheer, white veils. It extended out from her head, making her appear much larger than she was. Behind her, Rinoa was swaying slightly in place. Her face blank, her body out of her control. "Come, child," the sorceress said silently, "the show must begin." She walked forward confidently. The bells in her hair chimed brightly, the veils trailed behind her elegantly, Rinoa followed hypnotically. Sorceress Edia held out her hand and passed through the solid wood doors like water. As she stepped out into the hall that led to the podium and microphones set up for her use, she could hear the cheers of the crowd washing over her. President Delling, the greedy old fool, was already there waiting for her. He held out his arm, his smile bright, as he indicated that she should take her place. He had already introduced her and everything. Greed and victory danced in his eyes. The temptation of every promise that she had made was like a beacon on his face. His desire for more was an empty void that could never be filled. It had been all too easy to put him under her control. She hadn't even needed magic. It was time to begin part 2. Down in the crowd, Irvine let out a breath as the cheers grew louder. The golden accessory that the sorceress wore came into view first.
"Here she comes,"
he said in an aside to Squall. Sorceress Edia reached the podium and stopped. Behind her, her puppet continued forward and moved slightly to the side so she was even with Delling, on the opposite side of the balcony.
"Rinoa."
The president frowned at her even as he clapped for Edia. He hadn't seen the girl since she ran away from home last summer. What was she doing here? What was wrong with her? The position that Rinoa stopped in, still swaying slightly, was completely visible to the crowd. Irvine noticed her first. He grabbed Squall's shoulder and pointed.
Hey! That girl! Isn't that?"
Squall turned his eyes up and frowned. It was hard to make out individual faces from this distance, but that blue duster was unmistakable.
"Rinoa."
He felt his heart clench painfully in his chest before falling into a black hole in his stomach at the sight of her. What was she doing up there? Fear filled his veins for a split second. Then training took over and that fear was cast down into the same void his heart had fallen. Seeds were calm and logical. Panicking would help no one. She was still alive. As long as she was alive, there was still a chance to save her. He had to remain calm. An icy chill came over Squall's body as he let that calm come over his mind. Like a shield against fear and doubt, it settled over him. Above them, Edia tilted her head curiously and looked down at the gathered people. So many of them, all screaming and waving banners and hands and whatever else they could find. It was almost funny, the dichotomy of it all. Now then, for the finishing touches.
"Lowlifes."
Edia's voice was low, calm, almost hypnotic. The tone barely wavered as it was picked up by the microphones and cast over the adoring crowd.
"Shameless filthy wretches."
The words had no heat, no venom, no anything. The cheers died down slightly as her words washed over them all.
"How you celebrate my ascension with such joy! Hailing the very one you have condemned for generations! Have you no shame? What happened to the evil, ruthless, sorceress from your fantasies? The cold-blooded tyrant that slaughtered countless men and destroyed many nations."
Edia held out her hands as though she were really asking and confused.
"Where is she now?"
Her hands came down as Delling frowned at her.
"She stands before your very eyes to become your new ruler."
Edia started laughing. Deep and low, chuckling that lacked mirth or joy. President Delling, startled by her words, stepped forward. What was going on? This wasn't what they had agreed on.
"A new era has just begun,"
Edia promised them darkly.
"Edia,"
Delling tried to say so the mics wouldn't pick up his voice.
"Are you all right?" "Ada ugh."
The slow-moving sorceress who spoke so gently struck like a viper. The claws at the ends of her hands speared easily through Deling's sternum and pierced his heart. Like he was light as air, Edia lifted him up and over her head. Poison flowed down her arm and into his veins, destroying the cells there beyond repair, so no cure spell, no matter the strength, could revive him.
"This is your new reality,"
Edia told the crowd as loud cry came from the people. The soldiers, all under her command now, didn't react at all.
"No one can help you. Sit back and enjoy the show."
The crowd rushed towards the gates. In anger at seeing their president killed, in joy at seeing one tyrant overthrown. She couldn't know. She didn't care. Deling was dead and his reign of terror was ended before it could properly begin. Edia turned, throwing out her arm. Deling's body slipped from her grasp and flew. It landed in an undignified slump on the balcony. The poison began steaming up from the holes in his chest, polluting the air as it destroyed his body.
"Rest assured, you fools,"
Edia told the audience as the gun-wielding soldiers started trying to instigate order once again.
"Your time will come. This is only the beginning. Let's start a new reign of terror. I will let you live a fantasy beyond your imagination."
Edia turned from the podium and walked slowly back towards the guest room. She had a parade to throw. Her puppet remained behind, still swaying gently in place. Edia was in no rush as she walked back down the hall. Her measured footsteps were unhurried and calm as she continued away from the man she had just killed and the country that she had just thrown into disarray. Things were only going to get better from here. She stopped in the hallway and gathered her magic into her palms. There was one thing left to do to cinch the evening. One more task that had to be completed.
"Let us end this ceremony with a sacrifice,"
she said, throwing up her hands and casting out the magic. The Ark of Triumph, built to honor the dead warriors who had defended Galbadia before Vinzor Deling had taken over, was a beautiful work of architectural art. The gargoyles that rested against its stone body were so realistically carved that it seemed like the sculptor might actually have petrified all the monsters before setting them against the stone. Edia's magic converged on two of them. Hanging off against the side, their sightless eyes forever gazing out on Deling City. They blinked as life flooded into their veins. Mighty heads turned around as stone scales flashed to life and color. Heavy feet moved against the stone walls. A long tail flicked around as purpose flooded their now living bodies. Attack! Muscles bunched and tightened as they launched themselves from the side of the building. The crowd, already in a state of panic thanks to Edia, was even more frightened by the sight of two unfamiliar monsters suddenly sprinting through their ranks. Squall and Irvine both heard the new cries of fear at the same moment. They turned just in time for their eyes to track to arc of the monster's jumps. On the balcony, Rinoa blinked. Something felt like it had been cut free. The voice in her head silenced as she stumbled slightly when her body was suddenly put back under her control. Just in time for her to focus on the monsters that were bearing down on her.
"Hey! Hey, hey!"
Below, Irvine was shaking Squall as he pointed to the monsters that were now in a frenzy. Rinoa had dropped out of sight.
"She's in trouble, big time. We've got to help Rinoa."
Squall jerked out from under his grasp.
"The parade hasn't started yet. The gate's not open."
Cold, calculating, calm. There was just no way to get inside right now. Moving and panicking would accomplish nothing and might even make things worse. At least, with the crowd worked up as it was, they didn't need to worry about making a scene.
You gotta be kidding!
Irvine hissed through his teeth, looking back up to where he could see the tail end of the monsters fading into the residence. Rinoa was still nowhere to be seen. Irvine knew that Squall was right. It didn't make waiting any easier. Quistis made a sound of distress as the loud cries of the crowd could be heard echoing even all the way here. The clock tower was ticking past 19:30.
Oh, no! It's starting! We need to get out of here, quick!
She turned back to the room, her heart in her throat. Selfie was tugging relentless on the door. She had one foot up against the frame, throwing her entire body into the action. Zell was digging through the desk, looking for a key or a control panel or something that could get them out. Quistis bit her lips as she moved past the couch. Her eyes were moving over the angel statue in the corner. Her hands held out like she was offering something. Come on, think. There had be something. Caraway was a top army general. This was his office. She found it hard to believe that he would have a mechanism to lock himself inside without some way of getting out again. She walked past the statue and found herself looking at multiple, miniature reflections of herself in the glasses on the shelves in the wall. What were they even for? How stupid to have a shelf of glasses that couldn't be used. He didn't even have something around to. Quistis's thoughts trailed off as the light from the ceiling glinted off of something that wasn't glass on the shelf. Behind the stem off a glass? Quistis reached out and took the glass in hand. No. In the stem of the glass. Quistis lifted the clear vessel up close to eyes. Someone had planted some kind of microchip into the glass. It was tiny, she might not have seen it at all were it not for the shining light. But it was definitely a microchip that had been embedded in the stem. Quistis lowered the glass, confused. But, why? Was it a memory card? If so, why put it in such a strange location? Actually, in looking at it, it wasn't dissimilar to the chips that seeds would hide about their person to act as IDs since it was foolish to carry around papers identifying who they were on missions. Squall kept his in the lion necklace around his neck. Quistis kept hers right under her belt at the spot where it latched together. It was a rather simple piece of technology. Used most often to gain access to areas that only seeds were permitted such as the reserved Balam hotel room, their private train car, and the emergency exits hidden around the garden. Those were designed only to be opened by Balam garden faculty or seeds with approved chips. This tiny microchip didn't open the door, did it? Quistis looked over to where Selfie was pulling against the knob. There was no scanner for the microchip there. So if it didn't open the door, what did it open? Quistis cast her eyes around quickly. The windows were too high to jump from for a normal man like General Caraway. The desk was completely unlocked as Zell proved by yanking everything, including the drawers themselves, out of it. There was nothing in the room that could be secured. Everything was open and purposeful and Quistis looked over to the angel statue. Quite a strange piece of artwork for a military man to have decorating his work office. Holding out her hands. Not like she was offering something, but like she was waiting for something to be offered. Wondering if she could be right, Quistis leaned over the statue. Her eyes narrowed at the space between her outstretched hand as she moved her head around slowly.
"What you looking at, instructor?"
Zell asked. She could hear him moving up behind her. Quistis didn't say anything for a moment. She was focused on finding. There. The glint of metal. Buried in the statue's palms behind her fingers. So well hidden that Quistis wouldn't possibly have seen it if she hadn't been looking.
What's up?
Selphie asked, seeing Zell converge on Quistis. She let go of the door and shook hands that had gone numb with effort. Quistis continued ignoring them as she reached forward with the martini glass. Oh, she hoped that she was right. The stem of the glass slid in past the statue's fingers and settled into her palms. Quistis heard a very soft but familiar beep as the microchip was scanned. The statue's arms lowered, the hinge motion acting as an unlocking mechanism. With it free to do so now, the statue slid back and to the side and revealed a long, narrow, empty corridor bathed in darkness.
No way!
Zell gasped, looking down.
Pretty sneaky.
Selphie admired with a laugh. Quistis nodded once, satisfied as relief flooded her veins.
Let's go. But we don't even know where it leads.
Selphie pointed out. Zell shrugged.
No use staying here.
Quistis agreed silently as she started jogging down the hidden passage. Was it an escape route to the streets? Or?
Ew, what's that smell?
Selphie asked as Quistis found herself at the top of a set of concrete stairs leading down. There was light here, soft but at least it was light. She descended quickly, turning as the stairs did, until the path ended at a ladder. The distinct smell of sewage waste was stronger now, coming up from below.
Oh, Hein.
Zell threw back his head.
I so didn't want to use the sewers.
Quistis said nothing as she grabbed the ladder. Sure, their profession wasn't always the most elegant one, but she would be damned if she allowed this mission to fail by her own folly. She was getting back to the Ark if she had to crawl through the sewers. The ladder down was short, but the distance really made a difference in smell. They tried to ignore the liquid that ran by them as they moved away from the ladder.
Zell, did you actually get a map of the sewer?
Quistis asked as she jogged down the small side path designed for sewer workers to traverse.
Well, I saw one. But I didn't actually think we'd need to use it. Can we hurry?
Selphie asked, her voice extra nasal from holding her nose closed.
I would rather not stay down here longer than we have to.
Quistis agreed. They ran along the sewer streets, trying to find a way out. A ladder up to the streets anywhere at this point would be just fine. They did pass manholes, but there was no way to get up to them. Zell frowned at one such opening as they passed under it. He could hear music and laughter from above. Were they passing under the presidential residence even now?
It's starting,
he said as they jogged forward. Almost directly above them, Squall and Irvine shared a look as a troupe of dancers wearing strange and flamboyant costumes emerged from the crowd surrounding the gates. Everyone was losing their minds, in joy or fear it was hard to tell. The Galbadian military, well trained only to obey orders, were keeping the people out of the street with violence if necessary. The gates swung open as the dancers started forward. Music was blasting over the gathered crowd. The large float/throne that came moving out from the presidential residence had columns tipped with fire, a glowing ring above not unlike the one at Balam in miniature, and the guest of honor herself sitting back with absolute ease as she gazed out on the people before her. Squall frowned as the full front of the float came into view as it began turning left. Irvine didn't look. He didn't care beyond a cursory glance.
Now's our chance.
He took off running, but Squall remained in place, staring at the float. Admittedly, he couldn't get all that good of a look because of the fireworks and the crowd and the general pomp of the entire event, so he could be wrong. But was that Squall? Irvine snapped, grabbing his attention.
What are you waiting for? Rinoa might die.
Right. He had far more important things to worry about right now. Squall turned and sprinted after Irvine. With all the commotion caused by the sorceress herself, no one paid the pair of running teens any mind. They were hardly the only ones moving. They weren't even trying to follow the parade, they were moving anti-parallel to it. They were also getting closer, for however brief a moment. Squall didn't stop moving, but he could start to see clearer now as they drew even with the float. The dancers kept moving, fireworks continued to blast into the sky. But as he passed by, Squall couldn't mistake that slightly blue shine from Hyperion's blade, or the silver of that familiar trench coat with the cross emblazoned on the back. And especially not that arrogant look that surpassed any that had graced that smug face before. Cypher lowered his Hyperion like he was waving to the crowd. Their cheers and adulation and condemnation washed over him like milk and honey. He actually straightened his hair. Such a vain, preening bird. Squall paid him little mind as he crossed the float. Rinoa was up there and he had his orders. Save her life in compliance with the first contract. Then set up Irvine in the clock tower in compliance with the second. Short, easy steps that required no thought or emotion to weigh him down. Irvine passed through the gates just a moment before Squall. They were running at a crouch so as not to draw attention to themselves. A position they straightened from the moment they were out of the public eye. The gates swung shut behind them automatically.
There.
Squall pointed, spotting a transport truck half unloaded with cargo. Irvine, still just a step ahead of him, reached the lowest crate first. Squall stood back for a moment, allowing him to climb up ahead of him. He was behind him by barely a second. They could reach the second-floor balcony from here. It was a short climb. Irvine moved a little slow for Squall's liking, but it was still quick. No sooner than Squall's boot hit the ground on the second-story walkway than he was turning and making his way to a service ladder he had spotted from below. His body was moving too fast for Irvine to keep up with now as he swung himself around and up. By the time Squall was climbing onto the glass roof, Irvine was just cresting the ladder. He made his way across the roof quickly towards the balcony that connect to the inner rooms. He ran past Deliang's lifeless body without a glance towards him. Irvine was breathing hard, trying to catch up, but Squall was too fast and determined. The doors to the sorceress's room had been knocked open, by a fleeing Rinoa or a chasing monster, he had no way of knowing. She hadn't made it beyond that room though. The sight of her small body crumpled on the floor hit Squall like a knife to the chest. The Valkyrie was off of her arm, embedded into the far wall. The monsters were converging on her slowly, drooling in anticipation of their meal. Rinoa was conscious though. She was breathing quickly. The sound of her sobbing could barely be heard over the monsters' low rumbles. Her body was shaking almost imperceptibly and she was keeping her head deliberately down so as not to see what was coming at her.
Rinoa!
Squall called out for her. A desperation like he had never known before was clenching on his heart like a vice. His call didn't lift her head. However, it did turn the monsters onto him. Good enough.
Blizzara!
Squall cried immediately, throwing out his hand. The spear of ice didn't hit either monster, but it did erect a cage of glittering spires around Rinoa extending all the way to the ceiling. He wouldn't be able to cast another spell so long as that one continued to persist. However, the monsters wouldn't be able to reach her there. She would be safe for a moment. Squall threw himself backwards just in time to avoid the pouncing claws of one of the iguana-like creatures as it descended on him. Irvine reached into his trench coat and pulled out his easily accessible weapon. He was already letting off a volley of shots as Squall maneuvered out of the way. However, he only got the attention of one monster. He turned to Irvine quite happily as the other continued to chase down the unarmed Squall. Damn! He needed time to pull his weapon out of his inventory. This was why he didn't like walking about unarmed.
Whoa!
Irvine barely avoided getting skewered his monster's claws.
Alright. Come on, bros. Let's try out my new magic. Fire!
Minotaur and Sacred occupied two spots in Irvine's brain. The younger brother above his left ear, the elder above his right. However, they reacted in sync to his command. The blast of fire out of Irvine's glove left him grinning. The fireball raced towards the monster who hissed at its approach. But it didn't try to move. The red shield, invisible until the instant the fire spell hit it, seemed to bounce the fireball off of its surface like a rubber ball. Irvine's eyes widened as he cried out. The reflected fire spell slammed against him, sending him falling backwards. The acrid scent of singed hair and skin filled his nostrils as pain erupted in his arms and face. The burn wasn't bad, but it was painful.
Cure!
He commanded. The brothers released the spell, taking away the pain. Irvine rolled away and came up on his feet, swatting at his face to remove the soot and ash.
Squall! This one has got reflect magic on him.
Squall cursed as he ran through the sheer curtains around the room. The fabric was making it hard for the monster chasing him to jump and target effectively. Well, he supposed then it was a good thing that he was using his magic to shield Rinoa at the moment. His gun blade was still safely tucked away though. He needed just a moment, a few short seconds, to pull it out. Squall wasn't a bare fists type of fighter. His knowledge in that fighting style was bare minimum at best. Certainly not good enough to take on these two monsters. Where did these monsters even get a spell like Reflect anyway? They didn't look like the sort of monster that could cast magic, and if they could, why had they not done so already? Squall could detect no hints of magic usage in this room apart from his own. Unless the magic wasn't coming from them. As he ran, Squall reached into his pocket and pulled out the Odin capsule he used to hold Shiva when she wasn't in his head. Drawing magic from monsters was an inefficient, but effective, method of stocking up on spells. Most monsters had some inherent magic regardless of whether or not they could actually cast the spells. There was only one way to find out if the Reflect spell was their own making or not. Squall turned and dropped so suddenly that the monster wasn't prepared for it. His next leap took him right over Squall's head. As the monster was coming in to last, Squall was back up on his feet and charging at the monster instead. He launched himself in the air. One boot hit the monster's flank and he propelled himself forward from there. He landed just behind the monster's neck like he might be riding it. The enormous reptile roared out in anger as it tossed his head from side to side to dislodge the attacker. Squall's thighs tightened as he clutched one of the spiky scales sticking up from its neck in order to hang on. He pressed the release button of the capsule and slammed it down against the monster's rough hide. The pull of the capsule affected both of them equally. However, Shiva was inside of Squall, preventing his magic from being stolen. The monster bucked wildly a few times, but he couldn't stop the drawing of power into the capsule. Squall blinked as he saw something red and shimmering out of the corner of his vision dissolve from around the monster. He pulled back the capsule and tried to put it into his pocket. The monster bucked again and the tiny, marble-sized machine flew from his grasp. He heard it clicking against the ground but couldn't follow where it landed as he gripped the monster tighter to avoid being thrown. Well, he wasn't likely to get a better time. With one hand holding him onto the monster, Squall reached into his jacket with the other. The quick release on the inventory was programmed to restore whatever item was most recently placed inside. If Squall was ever in a position to need it, he made sure that his gun blade was always the last thing put in for quick retrieval. The heavy, familiar grip on the shear trigger hit his palm as he pulled the gun blade out. The monster started jumping around wildly in its effort to dislodge him. It was too late now. Squall turned the blade and slammed it down. He cut through the hard scales, through the spinal cord of the monster. Its life ended, the magic reversed, and the monster turned to stone that cracked and shattered as its own momentum sent it falling. Squall jumped from its back at the last moment. He hit the ground as rock and stone showered around him. Much more comfortable with his blade in hand, Squall looked to Irvine. The demolition ammo proved incredibly effective against the monster. Already, it was bleeding from a large hole in its side. It was still chasing Irvine down though as he reloaded. He hit the wall. Turned and cocked his shotgun. A loud bang. The reptile exploded in a burst of stone and dust that fell over Irvine like a shower. Breathing hard, Irvine stared ahead in disbelief. His life had been normal at one point, he thought. Squall ignored him and moved quickly over to where Rinoa was. As he got in closer, he started dissolving the ice he had wrapped around her. The sudden quiet, more than anything, was what drew Rinoa from her scared thoughts. Why was it suddenly so silent? Had she finally died? The cold, for most people, was not a comforting sensation. They preferred warm embraces and fiery passions. But the cold, to Rinoa, reminded her of one person. Her eyes opened on a sparkling cage that was melting away from her. Black leather boots stepped into her field of vision. Then he was kneeling down in front of her. Rinoa lifted her face up to him. Tear stains marked her cheeks. Fear clouded her eyes. She felt so ashamed looking at him in that moment. Squall's eyes moved down her body and back up again. Though she was afraid, he saw no signs of pain or limited movement from her. He detected neither the scent nor sight of blood. Fear would fade, given time, injuries needed to be seen to immediately. He saw none and his eyes moved back to hers. So calm. So detached. On anyone else, Rinoa would have been mad to have such a gaze given to her after the biggest fright of her life. But this was Squall. Calm and detached was how he did things. She could know that things weren't bad because he wasn't reacting to it. The chill of the air around him wrapped around her. Shiva's protective hand reaching out. It was more steadying than 1,000 hugs and reassuring, meaningless words that everyone else gave out.
I was scared,
she whispered to him, hating to admit it. It felt like a weakness. In the face of his calm, such an emotion was useless. He nodded, accepting her admission without comment. Then he stood. Fear would fade, and they had a job to finish here. The sooner they finished, the sooner he could get her out of here. She was safe, that was the most important thing. Squall didn't get more than a step away from her. Rinoa moved so quickly that it surprised herself. She threw her torso up and grabbed hold of Squall's hand as a sob tore through her throat. He turned back to see her on her knees, fresh tears falling down her cheeks.
Really scared,
she repeated, a simple declaration of her own state. Damn, he really wished she wouldn't look at him like that. He felt so helpless to see those large brown eyes staring at him, so large and terrified.
It's over now,
he assured her quietly.
I was scared,
she repeated, shaking his arm like he didn't understand.
I was really, really scared. You're used to battles, aren't you?
He asked, reminding her gently of all the fights she had been in on her way here. He had actually been rather proud of her progress. Rinoa was shaking her head, her body slumping. One hand refused to let go of Squall's though. She couldn't bear to be separated from him right now.
I couldn't. I just couldn't. I couldn't fight alone.
Her eyes moved over to where her Valkyrie had been embedded into the wall. She had run. She had fired without looking over her shoulder. All of Squall's careful instruction had come to nothing when forced to fight on her own. She wasn't ready for all of this. He should never have brought her here. He should have ignored the order to pretend she was a seed and say her order to keep her safe superseded it. He could only blame himself for wanting her near. He should have put her on the first train to Balam. Then he wouldn't have to see that broken look on her face.
We better get going,
he said softly, pulling on her gently. Rinoa released him, and he thought for a moment that was that. He had only taken 2 steps. That was the amount of time Rinoa needed to jump to her feet and run at him. He was pushed forward slightly when she grabbed onto his arm, holding it close to her body. Her eyes were screwed tight shut as she prevented him from leaving her side. She was traumatized. She hadn't been mentally prepared for real battles. Squall blamed himself.
I haven't forgotten your order,
he said softly, reminding her that he was supposed to keep her safe. She remained unmoving, clenching his arm. The strength of his muscles, the scent of his jacket, the cold air around him, it all came together in the most soothing balm she could imagine. She didn't want to let that go yet. Squall let out a long breath. Damn. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep pushing her away anymore. It just hurt too damn much. That look on her face, knowing what happened to her the moment he left her alone, was too heavy a burden to bear on his soul. In that case, there was only one way to go. The complete opposite direction.
Just stay close to me,
he told her gently. The kindness in his voice surprised Rinoa into opening her eyes. She looked up at him and, for the first time since walking into this room, she felt her heart beginning to calm down. His stormy grey eyes had never looked so clear as they did in this moment. Staring directly at her as he always did. But there was something in their depths that she had never imagined coming from Squall before. A sort of tenderness. It hit her so hard in the heart that it stole her breath for a moment. Her fingers tingled, slightly numb, as her iron grip on his jacket relaxed. She nodded, her tears coming under control as a strange sense of comfort and security settled over her. For how could she not feel safe knowing he was looking after her? Squall nodded, and the storm clouds moved back over his eyes. But she had seen the tenderness and that was all she needed. She could feel strong again as she followed after him. Irvine stepped forward, smiling to see she was okay and holding out her Valkyrie.
Thank you,
she said as Squall reached out and took it for her. She raised her arm and hit the magnetic return so it could attach to her once again. Then she folded it up and lowered her arm. Just a little bit better. Her eyes, still downcast, caught the glint of metal sparkling at Squall's feet. Frowning, she bent down and picked up the fallen capsule.
"What's this?"
she asked, standing.
"Don't know, yet,"
Squall admitted.
"Open it and find out."
Rinoa pressed the release on the capsule and the GF within gladly merged in with her arm. She felt Diablo's perk up curiously as this foreigner made its way up into her head.
"Carbuncle,"
Rinoa said aloud, looking at Squall. He shrugged.
"I got him from that monster. You can keep him."
She nodded and reached up to touch her head. She could feel Diablos and Carbuncle feeling each other out cautiously. She wasn't sure that they liked one another. Carbuncle was such a sweet, warm, airy sort of feeling and Diablos was, well, not.
"Let's go,"
Squall said, indicating with his head down the hallway.
"The hatch to the clock tower should be back that way."
He led the way down the hall, Rinoa right next to him, towards the hatch. It was too easy to miss as it blended almost seamlessly with the rest of the floor. It was narrow, not really made for hulking masses to move through it. Squall lifted the hatch and went down first himself. Because she couldn't stand to be apart from him, not yet at least, Rinoa hastened down immediately afterwards. Inside the clock tower, everything was so much more quiet. The noise from outside was deadened by the heavy layers of sleeping machinery. It was darker in here, colder. Rinoa felt even better in this room for that alone. Irvine was climbing down into the room as Squall moved over to the other side of the narrow metal walkway. He kneeled down as Irvine hit the ground. With the hatch closed shut behind him, it was almost like they were in another world. Rinoa turned back to Squall to see him standing with the high-powered, specialized sniper rifle that Caraway had hidden here days ago. The metal was cold and heavy but looked quite comfortable in Squall's hands as he turned to Irvine. He held it out, his face impassive.
"Irvine Kinias, it's in your hands now,"
he said, his voice soft, echoing slightly around the room. Irvine reached up with one hand and took the gun. The look on his face in that moment wasn't one of arrogance or pride. Rinoa expected some sort of assurance that he could handle it. At least some sort of snarky comment. She didn't at all expect him to grasp the sniper rifle in a non-show-off way, nod once slowly and seriously, before turning and taking soft, deliberate footsteps away from them. Squall frowned at his retreating back. Why'd he get all quiet? Irvine moved over to the front of Carousel Clock. He leaned back against one of the hologram machines before slowly lowering himself down to the ground. The gun was nestled between his legs, his hat and hair falling down to conceal his eyes. Ah! Of course. He must be concentrating, Squall nodded, satisfied. It was good to know that Irvine took his job seriously. Squall didn't mind him being insufferable the rest of the time so long as he did what he was supposed to when he had to do it. Squall looked around, up at the ceiling that would fall away when they were due to rise. It was so quiet in here. The only thing he could make out was Rinoa's gentle footsteps as she moved over to one of the near hologram machines. Squall watched as she sat on the rim of the lens. She kept her eyes down, sort of lost in her own thoughts. Squall moved down as well and sat on a hologram machine himself, sort of across from hers so he could keep her, Irvine, and the hatch entrance in his sight. What was going on with the parade? How close were they to being finished? He couldn't see the digital clock from in here, but it must be getting close to time. And now that things were finally calm for a moment, no matter how short that moment was, he could finally think back to the part of the parade he had seen. More specifically, the dead man he had seen riding the float beside the sorceress who had kidnapped him. His eyes looked over to where Rinoa was staring down at her feet. Cypher had been special to her. She deserved to know.
Rinoa.
She looked up, her face blank.
Cypher's alive. He was in the parade with the sorceress.
Squall was ready for happy tears. For some sort of jubilant reaction. From the same Rinoa that had thrown her arms around him just the second time she had seen him, he imagined hearing someone thought lost was back from the grave would be a great thing. Her face didn't change expression at all. She didn't react for a long moment. And when she finally did speak, she didn't ask the question he was expecting.
So what does that mean? Who knows?
Squall shrugged, crossing his arms. He certainly hadn't looked unhappy about where he was. In fact, Squall didn't think he had ever seen Cypher look so smug and self-important in all his life. And Squall had seen Cypher at both his very best and his very worst. If Cypher was alive, it was his duty to contact the garden and let them know. More than that, as a seed candidate, he was required to return to garden. But if he had decided to stand beside the sorceress instead? If he had finally given up on a seed dream that he had been promised he would never attain? If Squall was forced to face the sorceress directly, would he have to go through Cypher? He had no feelings about that either way. However, once again, Rinoa had been close to him. Squall looked over to see her slowly kicking her straightened legs out in the air. He felt he owed it to her to at least warn her.
I may end up killing Cypher.
The words were both easier to say and harder to utter than he would have guessed. It wasn't like he was unused to fighting Cypher. At the same time, killing a person that had always been such a big part of his life was rather a daunting thought. Rinoa said nothing. Her legs dropped with her head. Her hair fell over her eyes. Again, not the reaction he would have expected from her. Slowly, Rinoa brought her head back up. Her face was totally neutral. Squall wasn't sure that he liked that look upon her normally bright face.
You're both prepared, right?
She finally asked, her tone completely indifferent. She let out a short sigh.
That's the kind of world you live in. Both of you. You've had a lot of emotional training. But, of course, I'd rather it not happen.
He found that he would rather the same thing. But he was a seed. He didn't get to choose who his enemies were. And if he found himself facing someone he knew personally, then that was just a fight he had to face like any other. Anyway, it was out of his control.
It's all up to Irvine.
Squall looked over to where the sniper was sitting. He hadn't moved since he had gone to sit over there. What was he doing? Squall stood up and walked over to where Irvine was, something nagging at him about the way that the sharpshooter was acting. He crouched down beside Irvine and that nagging feeling became a dreadful certainty as he saw that Irvine was twitching uncontrollably. Was he freaking out?
Don't tell me you're getting the jitters,
Squall said, his voice low with disbelief. Irvine leaned back, his face drawn with horror.
I, I can't do it.
Squall groaned as his face fell into his hand. This right here was why seeds didn't like working with non-seeds. Quistis jumped from the peak of the water wheel that was just about her size and landed on the tall walkway into the next portion of the sewer. The water wheels that helped move sewage had the secondary advantage of helping to generate electricity throughout the city. It was a great way to generate power. But the water wheels were still covered in filth. Quistis made a face as she wiped her gloves off against the sewer walls. Selfie, who rode the wheels without touching them with her bare hands, landed next. Zell, who wished his nose would hurry up and get accustomed to this horrible smell, landed third.
How much further?
Selfie asked, groaning.
I think.
Quistis narrowed her eyes at the end of the hall.
Yes. I think there's a ladder there that we can take up. Come on. We're running out of time.
With the end finally in sight, Quistis sprinted eagerly down the sewer tunnel. Zell and Selfie were right on her back as they crossed the bridge in front of the biggest water wheel yet. The ladder that led upwards was in good working condition. It didn't start to fall the second that Quistis put her weight against it. Glad this nightmare was finally coming to an end, she hurried up the ladder. She didn't know where she expected to come out. She had hoped, of course, that it was somewhere close to the Ark. She didn't dare to begin to hope that it would be in the Ark. The small, lower room that led only up and down was familiar to her from this afternoon.
No way.
Zell breathed as he came up.
Let's go.
Quistis put more speed in her limbs as she continued on to the top floor. The portcullis control panel was a simple switch on the top floor. Quistis ran to it eagerly. Zell and Selfie converged on the narrow window that looked out over the streets. The parade was coming down the road now. Zell could see the clock tower from here. Just as General Caraway had told them, it was all timed perfected.
Just made it,
Zell said, his body going cold as he realized how close they had cut it. 19:59 and 58 seconds. 19:59 and 59 seconds. 20 o'clock and 0 seconds. Inside the clock tower, Squall looked up and around as all the machinery whirred to life. The holograms of dancing, performing gestures burst to life as the carousel was raised up. Damn! What a time for Irvine to admit that he couldn't control his own nerves. The parade was making its way under the Ark. It was time.
Instructor.
Zell turned to Quistis at the control panel.
Now. Hit the switch.
Breathing hard, Quistis flipped the large lever down. The light changed from blue to red and she looked around as she heard something give. The metal gates of the portcullis were loud as they came zooming down from above. The sorceress jumped to her feet as first the ones behind her, then the one in front, crashed against the ground. The force of the sudden drop broke the stone under the Ark and fractured off tips of the portcullis. But she was successfully trapped.
Irvine Kinias.
Squall snapped.
I can't.
Irvine shook his head.
I'm sorry, I can't do it. I always choke like this when it comes to hitting human targets. I try to act all cool, joke around, but I just can't handle the pressure.
There was no way he could hit her.
Forget it. Just shoot.
Squall was merciless. They didn't have time for this.
My bullet. The sorceress.
Irvine was turning forward, which Squall considered a step in the right direction, but he didn't bring up the rifle.
I'll go down in history. I'd change the history of Galbadia. Of the world. It's all too much.
He was only working himself up further.
Enough. Just shoot. I can't, damn it.
Okay, this wasn't helping. Squall needed to talk him through this slowly. As much as he hated to admit it, he needed Irvine in this moment. He needed him to shoot.
Irvine, calm down,
Squall said firmly, injecting some calm into his own voice.
Everyone is waiting on you. I don't care if you miss. Whatever happens, happens. Just leave the rest to us. Just think of it as a signal. A sign for us to make our move. A signal.
Irvine repeated, latching onto the inoffensive words. Yes. Squall got him. He nodded his head once.
Please.
Irvine let out a shaky breath as he finally lifted his gun. His line was perfect. Squall could tell the rifle fit comfortably in his hand. He might have not taken down a human target up to this point, but his training was still flawless. The sights were set. Irvine could see right through to the sorceress like she was directly in front of his face. She was looking around, trying to see what had happened.
Just a sign.
Irvine repeated to himself. Squall's ever-calm, unconquerable presence beside him steadied his hand as his heartbeat slowed for just a second. A second was all he needed. Bang! The sorceress moved so fast that they didn't actually see her do so. Her hand was up almost at the exact same time that Irvine pulled the trigger. The bronze bullet slammed against an iridescent blue barrier, a powerful sorceress-style protection spell right over her face. Irvine fell back on his butt, his breathing and heart rate elevated again. He looked to Squall, shame at his own actions darkening his face.
I'm sorry.
Squall shook his head.
No, it's okay. Your aim was perfect. Just leave the rest up to me. I'm going in for the sorceress.
Rinoa stepped forward as Squall stood up. He couldn't very well take her with him right now.
You should get going. Get out of here.
He said, then looked to Irvine.
Take care of her.
With only that, Squall ran and leapt from the top of the carousel. He heard Rinoa say something behind him, but he was focused right now. He landed down on the path leading to the balcony and podium. He preferred it this way anyway. Pulling his shear trigger from his sheath, Squall let out a cry as he ran and leapt from the top of the presidential residence. The crowd was losing its mind. The death of their president. And now the attempted assassination of the sorceress that had killed him. The Galbadian soldiers were having a great deal of difficulty maintaining their increasingly fragile control over the people. Squall's landing brought him directly on top of one such soldier in riot gear. It was only the full body shield that he carried that prevented Squall's gunblade from slicing clean through him. As it was, he probably wouldn't survive the blow he received to the head when Squall put him down. Squall didn't bother to give him a second glance. He was sprinting. There. A blue car with an open roof and a running engine. Its occupant, whoever they were, had long been evicted from the vehicle, probably by force. Squall commandeered the vehicle for himself. He vaulted into the front seat, landing awkwardly because of his sheath. He wasn't going to be inside long though. The streets had already been cleared by the parade. Squall faced minimal resistance from people. He didn't care if he hit them either. He backed up quickly, turning as he did so, then slammed his foot on the gas. The arc was waiting for him. He was aimed directly for the back of the float. At the last second, he jerked the car wheel to the side, then applied the brakes. The car's momentum slid it all the way up against the grille of the portcullis. Squall then used the force of the blow to launch himself out of the car. His body slipped easily through the iron bars. These gates weren't actually meant to keep anyone out, they were mostly just decoration. From within though, there was nothing to stop Squall from climbing up the back of the float. The sorceress could hear him climbing and she grinned. Cypher heard the blow from the car and felt the excitement heating up his blood. It was all very calm somehow as Squall reached the top. Neither the sorceress nor Cypher made a move to stop him as he came around to the front of the float. The area here was rather narrow for fighting, but it would have to do. Cypher grinned at him, like there was nothing better than for Squall to be there in that moment. Squall stopped walking, his hand resting on the hilt of his shear trigger. Hyperion was already out, ready for combat. Cypher was grinning at him. That hungry look that had made Squall so uncomfortable back in Dalit was on his face again.
"Well,"
Cypher said, shrugging as if to say, "What are you gonna do?"
"So this is how it turned out."
Squall let his eyes move down to the sorceress then up to Cypher again.
"You've become the sorceress's lapdog." "I prefer to be called her knight,"
Cypher said proudly, sticking out his chest.
"This has always been my dream."
Squall scoffed.
"Serving on your knees? That's your romantic dream."
Cypher's face turned ugly in scorn.
"And what are you?"
Squall wasn't given a chance to answer. Cypher struck out. Squall ripped the shear trigger from his sheath and caught Cypher's blade against his own. For as long as anyone could remember, Squall and Cypher had been fighting. Illegally and inelegantly as underclassmen, then latter dangerously and efficiently as seed candidates. They had trained each other for lack of a teacher. There was not a single move that one had the other didn't know and couldn't successfully counter. They were both fast. They were both strong. They were both skilled. Two gunblade masters clashing before a mighty sorceress. A mercenary against a knight. It was the sort of thing Squall would probably find in one of Cypher's bad movies. But the steel here was real. The fight was deadly. Shear trigger had only been upgraded as a gun. The blade was the same. It was heavier now though and Cypher hadn't been neglectful of his training since last they fought. A prolonged training session that seemed like 1,000 years ago now. The clash of steel on steel echoed loudly under the Arc of Triumph. Sparks flew from their blades as parries and thrusts were countered and blocked. Cypher kicked out with his foot towards Squall's groin. A dirty trick he had used many times before that Squall no longer fell for. Squall attempted to slice the tip of his blade across Cypher's arm to prevent him from holding his weapon. A move that Cypher had taught him and also didn't work. Locked in a death battle that neither had ever truly won. But Cypher had been reveling in his glory at becoming a knight. Squall had upgraded his weapon and been getting down and dirty fighting new and difficult monsters. The armor-piercing rounds in Squall's gun blade deal more damage than Cypher was expecting. The explosion of ice shards sent Cypher falling backwards. Squall was over him in a moment, hacking downward and forcing Cypher backwards. His advantage didn't last. Cypher kicked out and slammed his foot against the side of Squall's knee. The involuntary buckling reaction was outside of Squall's control. He fell and rolled immediately. Hyperion slammed into the ground where his body had been. Squall felt the air coming off of it as it cut a line through the back of his jacket. Both men were back on their feet, coming at each other. Cypher swiped out wide, forcing Squall back. Then Cypher turned and sliced through one of the burning pedestals at the corner of the float. A cloud of ash and soot exploded from the fire.
Arrow!
Cypher laughed. Squall's eyes slammed shut as the dust fell over his head. He started coughing. Reflex and instinct brought up his blade to catch Cypher's next attack because he certainly couldn't see it coming.
Squall, you're mine!
Cypher laughed maniacally, coming at him fast now. Squall couldn't see. His defense was now significantly lacking. Blows started getting through. Never hitting anything vital. Cypher liked to play with his food before he ate it. Pain blossomed then was quickly staunched in his arm. His leg. Across his chest.
Did you mourn me, Squall?
Cypher asked, laughing as he cut away at Squall's body.
Did you think I was dead after attacking the president? Tell me truthfully. I would never die so easily. Not until I had fulfilled my dream.
Squall blinked. The ash in his eyes burned and colored everything gray, but he could see. He caught Cypher's next attack. Deflected it. Then kicked out. His boot landed hard against Cypher's chest. The blond man fell backwards. Squall turned in place, letting out series of quick shots from his gunblade. The magic within carefully controlled by Shiva as the ring of absorbed heat appeared again. Cypher stood up as Squall leveled the gunblade at his chest. Fated circle. The blast of heat energy slammed into Cypher. He fell back, smoking. His skin, now raw and red, looked inflamed as Squall fell back a couple steps. He stole the quick second he had to quickly wipe some of the soot from his eyes. When he opened them again, slightly clearer now, Cypher was getting back up. He didn't look at all put out about being put down. In fact, he was grinning.
Ugh, not bad,
he admitted, rotating his shoulder.
You've been practicing. That one is new. You haven't. You're still using the same tired old moves.
Squall said calmly. The insult was a high one for Cypher. He growled as he pulled the Hyperion back. The twisting, almost hypnotic movement just proved Squall's point. He lifted sheer trigger and didn't move as Cypher put his magic into his blade. A non-elemental, pure magic energy attack that could slice down a fully grown tree. Just as showy as the man who crafted its deadliness. No mercy. The spinning shadow that came off of Cypher's blade looked insubstantial. It was deceptive, just as sharp as the Hyperion it was launched from. Squall didn't move as Cypher threw it his way. It was designed to come in low and slice up through the center of the body. At the last second Squall twisted out of the way. No mercy harmlessly flew him by.
Same old moves,
Squall mocked, charging. Squall's blade slammed against Cypher's. His body moved almost too fast as Squall threw himself into the speed attack Renzokuken. Cypher was just as fast as Squall was. He could parry each blow as it came at him. What Cypher lacked, however, was Squall's strength. The force of his stronger blade, the demands the weight of it put on his body, made Squall stronger. So while Cypher was deflecting the blows, he was still absorbing the bone-breaking energy of them into the palms of his hands. He cried out in pain. Squall kicked out and slammed his boot into Cypher's face. He turned. The butt of his gun blade crashed against Cypher's temple. The blond man had a look of surprise on his face as he crumpled down against the ground. Breathing hard, Squall took 2 steps back from him. Cypher's eyes rolled back into his head as he lost consciousness, but he remained breathing. It was, Squall decided, the best outcome he could ask for his old sparring partner. Still, he didn't remember it being that easy to bring Cypher down. It used to be that Squall could lay into him like that for hours and still not take him out.
"You're losing it, Cypher," he said sadly.
His eyes moved past his prone body and to Sorceress Edia, who remained reclining in her throne with absolute ease. She was looking at him through distant, golden eyes.
"A seed,"
she guessed easily. Then her lips curled in a sneer of disgust.
"Planted in a run-down garden."
Unafraid, refusing to feel anything, Squall bared his gun blade at her. Slowly, as though she had an eternity to do so, Edia unfolded herself from her chair. She moved slowly down off of her platform, keeping Squall in her line of sight. Her eyes focusing past his body told Squall that something was coming up behind him. He turned quickly, ready to take out whatever it was. Rinoa and Irvine pulled themselves up onto the float.
"I thought I told you to get out of here,"
Squall snapped at the pair of them.
"I have to redeem myself,"
Irvine told him seriously. He had his familiar shotgun back in hand as he stepped to Squall's side. All he could think about was that maybe Squall wouldn't be here, forced to fight, if he had just nut up and shot sooner. Rinoa's eyes focused on the down Cypher for only a moment before she looked back at Squall. Her shoulders were set, her eyes determined.
"I can fight. If I'm with you. That's why I'm here. I won't leave you alone."
She didn't mean it the way Squall took it. He knew she didn't mean it that way. It still felt like a punch to the gut to hear her declare that so openly. He turned away from her deliberately and back to the sorceress. Beside him, Irvine and Rinoa both cocked their weapons, prepared to fire. Edia watched the exchange with bored eyes.
"The accursed seed,"
they could hear her whispering to herself from across the float. The first spell she threw looked like a cross between thunder and blind. It exploded against Squall's gunblade and the energy of it burned along his skin under his leather jacket. Damn! Don't lose focus. She was just like any other magic-heavy enemy. Meaning she was probably good only at magic. That thin, skin-tight dress would offer no defensive abilities. He just had to get in close to her and he could bring her down.
"Surround her,"
Squall ordered the other two.
"And don't let her magic hit you."
Rinoa shot her Valkyrie first. A gust of wind from Edia blew it off course. Irvine took a shot from his Ulysses. The spreading shotgun pellets were caught against her protection shield. Squall charged forward, intending to get in so close her protection spell would be useless. Edia threw her magic at him again. Squall barely avoided getting speared by the ice from a Blizzara spell that burst from the earth. Shiva cried out a warning and he slashed out his blade. The icicles that were coming towards him shattered against the metal. So she wanted to play with ice, hey? Squall jumped backwards, landing in a low crouch. When he looked up again, his eyes were flashing ice blue. True, icy power surrounded him. He would show her ice.
Diamond dust.
The corridor of ice descended on Edia and she was caught completely in it. Squall squeezed his fist and the tunnel shattered. Ice shards ripped in and outside of her body. Her golden eyes opened. She looked almost completely unaffected.
Thundara!
She yelled, bringing down her hand. The electric spell burst through Irvine's body. He cried out as he seized uncontrollably. His finger tightened on the trigger of his gun and a hole appeared in the float at his feet. Squall lifted his blade and let out a quick shot. It was caught easily against her protection barrier. Damn! It was like she was untouchable. But her magic was destroying them.
Ruby light!
The cry from Rinoa caught Squall's attention. Her eyes were glowing red. They looked up, following something that Squall couldn't see. The Thundara spell faded and, a moment later, a bright red light expanded in front of Squall. What was that? Rinoa grinned as her eyes faded back to brown.
Thundara!
Edia cast again. Squall flinched. The spell bounced off of the red barrier in front of him. The same red barrier that the monsters had been using before. The GF's power was to summon reflect spells. Edia gasped as they reflected. Thundara crashed against her instead. She cried out, not from pain but from anger to have her own spell thrown at her. This was Squall's chance. He sprinted forward, bringing up his blade as he did so. Edia's eyes opened as he broke through her barrier. His gun blade swung down and caught against the metal claws extending from her fingers. She growled at him angrily, her bright eyes flashing.
Dispel!
She said to him. Squall blinked to see the ruby barrier protecting him fade out of the corner of his vision. He tried to jump back. Edia's other hand slammed against his chest.
Fira!
Squall cried out in pain. She had pushed directly past Shiva's protective layer of cold air. The fire blossomed out against his chest and sent him flying backwards.
Squall!
Rinoa cried out as he hit the ground.
Cure!
Squall lifted himself up, grimacing against the pain of burned flesh. It had been a long time, since he had first received Shiva, actually, that Squall had felt the pain of a burn. Exposed nerve endings screamed at him as Rinoa's cure spell took effect. Shiva was roaring in pain in his head. She couldn't handle the heat of a burn. Squall apologized to her and begged her to bear with it for a little longer. Shiva told him to kill that bitch that dared to burn the goddess of ice. Edia snarled at him. He had gotten in far too close. She wore no armor. If he had managed to cut through her now, everything would have been ruined.
Impudent seeds!
She snarled at them. Squall sprinted towards her again. The burst of cold, sparkling air that came off of Edia's body was only soothing to him. Rinoa and Irvine cried out because it was too cold for their unprotected bodies. Edia raised her hand slowly as the ice wrapped itself around her, then formed into a set of 3 long spears above her head. Her face completely blank, Edia launched the ice attack. Squall was immune to cold thanks to Shiva. Sub-zero temperatures meant nothing to him. However, being impaled was something he was unable to brush off. The ice spears flew through the air too fast to attempt to block. One just barely grazed the edge of Rinoa's reflect spell. Irvine was already diving out of the way and off of the float. There was nothing to protect Squall as the sharp spear slammed into his chest. Pain unlike anything he had experienced before erupted as the spear stuck there, just beyond his right shoulder, missing his heart, but cutting through his lung. Squall coughed and he felt the coppery taste of his own blood hit his tongue. Rinoa's eyes landed on him before widening in horror. Her scream ripped through the air so loudly that it could be heard over the crowd. Damn! Was this where he died? Squall's body was completely out of control. He felt like everything had gone into slow motion as he fell backwards. Instead of the float, his body hit nothing but air. Rinoa was running for him, dropping to her knees at the end of the float and reaching out for him desperately. The last thing he could see was her pretty face collapsed into heartbreak as he fell into the darkness. End of chapter.